advice.
Thanks, Chair. I'd like to start with a few threatened species to kick us off. So beginning with Leadbeater's possums. And so just beginning to what the current status of the Leadbeater's possum recovery plan process is.
Senator. So Jeff Richardson from Assistant Secretary Protected Species and Communities branch. So the Leadbeater's possum recovery plan is still in draft form, and at the time, late last year, late in 2017, when it was agreed that the Leadbeater's possum status would be reassessed to take account of new information that had been collected by largely by the State Government of Victoria.
By Vic Forests, yes.
Well, by Vic Forests and also by the Arthur Rylah Institute, that's right. The Minister also asked for the Threatened Species Scientific Committee in their reconsideration of the assessment of that species status and the new information, whether that new information had any bearing on the recovery plan that they had been drafting. So the current time frame for the recovery plan is to be finalised December 2018, so the end of this year.
I understand the Threatened Species Scientific Committee, they met to be discussing the new data. Can you tell me exactly when that meeting was?
It was exactly on the day of the last estimates hearing, Senator.
Yes.
So the 20, whatever date it was in February, Senator.
Right. Yes, it was February. So has there been any feedback to government about what their findings from that meeting were?
Senator, that meeting was attended by all of the members of the Threatened Species Scientific Committee, but it was also attended by officers within the department who are responsible for conducting that reassessment. But it also had a list of stakeholders, and I think I went through those at the last estimates hearing. The assessment of the species is going to be considered by the Threatened Species Scientific Committee, so the assessment was then updated taking account of information gathered at that workshop and will be looked at by the Threatened Species Scientific Committee in the first week of June at their next meeting.
Right, and
so they were participating in that meeting, but they didn't consider the Leadbeater's possum assessment at that meeting that was in the same week as that workshop.
And at that workshop, do you have any feedback about their response to the data, that's so-called new data from Vic Forest that was being provided to them, and whether they're also looking at the latest of the peer-reviewed science about what the threatening processes the Leadbeater's possum are?
So they were certainly looking at all science that was available, Senator, both peer-reviewed and not yet peer-reviewed, or
the Victorian Government internal reports, yes.
And published information, Senator. There is information on the Victorian Government DELP website as well, Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. Look, in terms of the assessment and if you like the committee's position on that new information, or where they see that as landing, that will be what will be discussed in a few weeks' time at their next meeting.
And so then so they've got that meeting in June to discuss that, and then they will make they'll make some recommendations to government. What's the expectation on the time after that meeting? So,
Senator, the Act requires that the assessment, a draft assessment, must be released for public comment for a period of not less than 30 days. So following that meeting, I anticipate that the draft assessment will then be released for public comment, for its statutory public comment process.
So fairly shortly after that meeting you would expect?
Well, the deadline for the assessment is in November, Senator, so it'll have to be reasonably soon thereafter, yes.
Okay. Do you have any response to the recent listing by the Zoological Society of London, which listed Leadbeater's possum at number 10 on its EDGE list of mammals on the brink of extinction? Right up there with species like the black rhino.
Sorry, what was the start of your question? Do I have a reaction to it?
Yes, what's the government's response to this international focus on the fact that we've got critically endangered Leadbeater's possum, and meanwhile we've got these processes that are just going on and on and on, all the while logging is continuing to occur in its habitat?
So, Senator, I guess I'd say that the species is under assessment at the moment by the Threatened Species Scientific Committee, which is a group of experts who are looking at what its current status is. It's currently listed as critically endangered, as you're well aware. It's got a pretty comprehensive conservation advice that guides efforts to recover the species. But as you're also aware, it's found within the area of a regional forestry agreement area, and it is subject to prescriptions that are enacted by the Victorian government.
So does the government think that it's acceptable then that it was 2015 when your own threatened species strategy identified the Leadbeater's possum as requiring emergency intervention? At that stage, the revised recovery plan was promised by mid-2016. That's over 2 years ago, 3 years ago since emergency intervention was recommended, 2 years since the revised recovery plan. I mean, how can this delayed response, this ongoing process be justified when the possum is on the brink?
Senator, I think Mr. Richardson is laying out exactly the reason for that. There's been a plunge.
But meanwhile, logging's continuing.
Right, but we want to make sure that we're making a well-informed and appropriate decision, and that's what Mr. Richardson's laid out.
Monitoring the Leadbeater's possum to extinction, essentially. You've got logging continuing while these processes continue.
Senator,
and
I
the
think
science is clear.
Mr. Richardson's also laid out a number of the prescriptions that the Victorian government has put in place to protect the species. We're looking at those along with the latest science to make sure that we're making as informed a decision as possible.
Do you accept that the community and people concerned about the status of critically endangered animals like the Leadbeater's possum have got a right to be frustrated at the amount of time the development of this recovery plan is taking?
And I can understand that concern. All I'm saying is there are honest reasons as to why it's taking the time that it is, and we're trying to make sure that we make an informed decision. We're obviously seized with the importance of this species. We wouldn't have looked at it twice in the last 3 years if it wasn't for that.
Thank you. I'll move on to greater gliders, and I asked a question on notice about whether there were actions being taken about the impact of logging on greater gliders, given that that's now been listed as a vulnerable species. And I was told that there's a National Environment Science Program project which is looking at existing long-term monitoring data, new field-based experimental research and radio tracking to strengthen the scientific evidence base of strategies to secure the long-term conservation of these and other species dependent on these forests. Can you tell me some more about what the timeline of this study is going to be?
Sorry, Senator, I'm just trying to locate my question on notice. I apologise, Senator. Could you just repeat that question?
Yes, well, I was in my question on notice. I was then told that there was a project under the National Environment Science Program's Threatened Species Recovery Hub, Project 3.2.2, which is outlining a project to analyse existing long-term monitoring data and new field-based experimental research and radio tracking to strengthen the scientific evidence base of strategies to secure the long-term conservation of these and other species dependent on these forests. So I'm wanting to know some more details about that strategy, in particular what the timeline and when, we're going to get some results from that strategy that would then feed into the protection of the greater gliders, while greater gliders go from vulnerable to being endangered, probably to critically endangered, while this research is undertaken.
Kylie Jonathan, First Assistant Secretary, Biodiversity Conservation Division. Hello, Senator. I think what we'd need to do is go back to the Threatened Species Hub and get an update on the timetable and the work that they're doing on that. So I'm happy to come back to you after I've spoken to scientists about where they're at with that work.
Do you accept that it's important that this work is undertaken and that action is taken in the interim period? Otherwise, we are going to see these animals, just like the Leadbeater's possum, just on this trajectory, just hurtling towards extinction while we know what the threatening processes are.
Thank you, Senator. I think, look, we do accept it's important, and that's why the project is happening. And as I said, I'd really like to get some advice from the scientists that are doing the work so that I can, on the timeframes, and come back to you with that. I guess we can also outline some funding that we also have put into the Greater Glider. There's a whole range of things that are happening in relation to that. Since 2014, a 200,000 threatened species targeted project has been funded to deliver habitat improvement by restoring traditional fire regimes and feral animal and plant control throughout Mount Lewis, Mount Spurgeon and the Mount Windsor National Parks. This project's being delivered in partnership with the Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service and the Australian Wildlife Conservancy. So
I'm particularly interested in the southern populations of the Greater Glider where they are being impacted by clearfell logging. I mean, since we were last here in Victoria, there's been a high population density hotspot, the highest population density of Greater Gliders being logged by big forests.
Thank you,
under
Senator.
the North East Forest
There's
Regional
also
Forest
been a number
Agreement.
of 20 million trees project that have been funded. These include projects in the Strzelecki Ranges and something in the order of 1.6 million was put into that. Overall, we've got around about 8 projects that total around about 3.5 million that have gone to work on the Greater Glider, to support work on the Greater Glider. And I think if I can get to the scientists that are doing the work under this program and get an update for you on that, I'll come back to you.
Are you
on that
aware
on
of the
notice.
logging of this very high population density hotspot in the logging areas, in the Barjug Flat logging areas, areas of forest in the Strathbogie forests?
Senator, that's a level of detail I'd be happy to take more information on that.
So
If you have that.
is the department aware, any of you at the table aware of what's going on there?
Senator, yes, we've seen the press reports, but that's been managed through our RFA area and our officers who are associated with that were here yesterday, but I don't believe they're here today.
So has there been a response by the federal government? Has the federal government sort of said that this is a EPBC listed species? It's, there's logging of one of the highest population density hotspots for the Greater Glider that's going on?
Senator, I think the response by the federal government is the significant funding, the 3.5 million that's been put into.
Meanwhile, you keep logging it. They keep logging it.
Senator, that the arrangements are set out through the RFA arrangements and ensuring that the work that is happening is consistent with the EPBC Act. There's around about 3.5 million, as I mentioned to you.
So
that's
has there
going
been
to
any
the Greater
federal
Glider.
response? Has there been any communication between the federal government and the Victorian government about the logging that's occurring of this hotspot for Greater Gliders?
I'd have to take that on notice, Senator.
Senator, I think as we said yesterday too, that obviously for the regional forestry agreements, the lead Commonwealth agency is the Department of Agriculture. We're happy to...
And I will be asking questions of the Department of Agriculture over
All
the
I was
coming
going to say,
days.
Senator, is we're happy to also raise this with the Department of Agriculture to ensure that they are aware of
But
that
you
as
are
well.
responsible for the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act, and this is a threatened animal under your Act. And
Understood, and that's why I'm saying that I'm happy to raise that with the Department of Agriculture as well.
Okay. So moving on to the western ringtail possum, which has just been uplisted to critically endangered, and I know my colleague Senator Seward was asking some questions about that yesterday, but what's going to be the reaction of the federal government in response to that uplisting to critically endangered?
Senator, when you say response, I mean the federal government was the one that uplisted it to
Yes.
critically endangered.
Yeah, so is there going to be any change to what's going to be happening to the management, recommendations for management by the federal government?
So, Senator, there is an updated conservation advice that was released when the species was uplisted earlier this year, late last year. I'll find that out. But there was also a recovery plan that was adopted, a Western Australian government prepared recovery plan that was adopted by the federal government last August, in August 2017, so pretty recently, which would have essentially taken account of the new information available on the species as at that time. In terms of what we will do to respond, it is a species that is listed as threatened. It's a matter of national environmental significance, so it triggers all of the governmental responses that any other MNES species triggers, which is to say that it becomes part of the regulatory process that we manage, but it also becomes a target for a target as a matter of NES in our funding programs. So it becomes, if you like, a species that will be targeted by our National Land Care program or its predecessors.
So is that recovery plan, what does it recommend in terms of addressing the ongoing logging of habitat of the western ringtail possum?
Senator,
Is the federal government, since being critically endangered, have you raised this issue with the West Australian government, who are the people who are undertaking that logging?
and the people that prepared the recovery plan, Senator. So I don't believe we've raised that directly with them since that recovery plan was put in place, but it is their recovery plan in a sense, and so I'd have to take on notice whether there's been any correspondence with the Western Australian Government.
So,
on that
I mean,
issue.
does the Commonwealth have a role, given that it's now critically endangered under your listings, to actually have a proactive response with the WA government, or is it just leaving it to them?
Senator, I guess what I can highlight for you is that we've mobilised around about 4.1 million for 19 projects that are supporting outcomes for Western ring-tail possum, and that includes a 1.7 million investment in Western Shield, which is to incorporate feral cat baiting into the statewide conservation program. So the federal government is contributing significant funds to efforts to
Are there any
protect the
programs
Western
to deal with
ring-tailed
the impact of logging on the Western ring-tailed possum habitat?
Sorry, Senator, what was the question?
Well, yes, I understand the critical importance of addressing feral animals and their predation, but is there any funding towards programs to be addressing the impacts of logging on Western ring-tailed possum habitat?
I don't have the breakdown of the projects, of the 19 projects under the 4.1 million, Senator, but I can get further information for you on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I've got a general question about recovery plans. And my understanding is that the department's usual practice is to review recovery plans every 10 years. Is that the case?
Recovery plans are reviewed periodically, Senator. There's no usual time frame, if you like, that we do that on. They're certainly reviewed at the time that a species assessment category is reassessed. As a lot of the recovery plans that we have in place were originally prepared by state governments and then subsequently adopted under the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act. And so state governments also will, as new information comes to bear, prepare new plans which are then considered for adoption subsequently.
But my understanding of the EPBC Act obligations is that recovery plans should be reviewed every 5 years. Is that the standard practice for the review timeline?
It's not, Senator. We don't meet that requirement of the Act. We review recovery plans as new information is available and as resources allow.
Okay, so when reporting on your whether you're meeting the obligations under the EPBC Act, so do you report that you're not meeting that requirement?
Correct.
Right, okay, thank you. And moving on to just generally the ministers and the Threatened Species Scientific Committee. I understand that the minister has the discretion to accept the advice of the Threatened Species Scientific Committee on which species, threatening processes or ecological communities should be considered for listing under the EPBC Act. I'm interested to know on how many occasions in the past 5 years has the Environment Minister rejected the advice of the Threatened Species Scientific Committee?
Senator, I'd have to take that question on notice to confirm.
So I mean, right, if you take on notice, so how often in the instances in the last 5 years? Yes. So to be rejecting the advice, whether to place on the priority assessment list a nomination for a key threatening process, a threatened species or a threatened ecological community.
I'll take that on notice, Senator.
Okay. Moving on to some threats to Australia's biodiversity, changing fire regimes is one of the leading threats. What's the status of the key threatening process nomination for fire regimes that cause biodiversity loss?
Senator, that's a nomination that was it's on our priority list and is still on our priority list, so it has not yet been listed. It's one that we are planning to refresh later this year, assuming the Threatened Species Scientific Committee is willing to do so, but it has not yet been finalised and it's not yet listed as a key threatening process.
So when is a decision expected as to whether it's a key threatening process?
Senator, I can't give you that timeline at this point. I have to take that on notice.
Okay, thank you. Novel biota was listed as a key threatening process under the EPBC Act in 2013.